The Nigerian government has requested National Assembly approval to borrow 45 trillion naira under the 2025 budget, sparking backlash from opposition leaders, economists, and civil society. Critics warn the move could raise public debt to 182 trillion naira by 2026, worsening Nigeria's debt sustainability, while the government argues the funds will finance infrastructure and economic reforms. Former Vice President Atiku Abubakar claims that the plan is irresponsible. Economic experts also question transparency and project viability. Concerns persist over rising debt service costs, foreign currency risk, and weak accountability for past loans. We have Basil Abia, a co-founder Veriv Africa, joining me now for the conversation. Good morning to you.
Good morning, Joanna. Absolute pleasure to be
Absolute pleasure to have you in. Coming to the debt situation, we have data that points to the fact that debt has surged to 144.7 trillion naira, up 65%. Experts are saying this could get to 187 trillion naira by the end of this year. Do we have anything to justify the level of borrowing that we're getting into and where we are at right now with our debt situation?
Yeah, thank you very much for the question. I think first and foremost, we have to understand that there are core sustainability and transparency issues with the potential borrowing plan of the presidency. You have to understand the basics first. And what are the basics? You know, President Tinubu is asking for a $21 billion loan in addition to another $2 billion loan. And then in addition to that, there's also a 153 billion Japanese yen. If you convert that to USD, that's about $103 million. So everything combined is about $24 billion. That's also separate from the $2 billion FX bond that federal government plans to issue to the domestic financial markets. Even though it's FX dominated, it's going to help with all of our FX FX responsibilities that we need to indulge in. Now, in addition to that, there's also a 754 billion naira pension bond that is going to be issued as well. And that is supposed to clear pension, the national pension, domestic pension liabilities that the government has incurred. Now, the presidency is saying that that is going to help out with the requirements of the National Pension Act. In addition to all of these, the argument, especially for this extensive and external borrowing plan, is that it will help in financing core projects. I think, again, for most of the analysts that I've spoken to about this, it's been a tough debate over the last 2 or 3 weeks since the news came out. Their concern has been that the projects, first and foremost, haven't gone through scrutiny. It hasn't gone through a cost-benefit analysis. And it's very vague, you know. They say things like increase employment, expand infrastructure projects, and stuff like that. Poverty reduction initiatives as well. But there's no specificity as to what these projects would be. And because of the lack of this specificity, there are no cost-benefit analysis. So the civil society organizations, the economists, the public policy analysts like myself, we're really in the dark as to why we're taking this heat in our debt threshold when we do not know what is going to be spent on.
Right.
And then third, and most importantly, is that because these are FX-dominated or FX-denominated loans, our debt servicing ratio is definitely going to increase. Let me give you a very important stat to note. Our debt service to GDP ratio is currently at 51.9%. Now, obviously, with the rebasing of GDP, it's expected that that will reduce to 40%, which is around the Fiscal Responsibility Act debt threshold that we ourselves as a country has, we have put on ourselves, just to reduce the level of extensive borrowings that we have, and also ensure that the debt system is very sustainable.
Right.
I'm sure you will understand that the debt management office are pushing for this as well. So when you now put that into context, you see the sustainability concerns in full view.
Yes, I mean, and it's understandable. You've highlighted that the need for us to have the details on some transparency so you can do proper analysis. We know that it's a proposal. National Assembly is to, grant that proposal, scrutinize it. We've had the CSOs also come in for a public or call for a public hearing. But we also have Dr. Tokpe Fashua, who's a special advisor to the president on economy, justify this level of borrowing, saying our GDP ratio has improved, right, from 52% to 50%. He also highlighted debt service costs. I think you brought that up as well, that has also reduced. What are your thoughts on this? Is this, are these indicators that we are in a good position to keep on borrowing?
It's a nuanced conversation. First and foremost, just because you have started to improve your debt service to GDP ratio doesn't necessarily mean you're going to lump in 2 fiscal years, you're going to lump an additional $24 billion just like that. There has to be justification for that. We need to be able to see the opportunity cost and the cost benefit analysis for that to indulge in all of that. And let's also not forget that there's a potential that this would increase further even when we rebase the GDP, which we're supposed to get the results for later this year. This additional $24 billion to our external debt stock would definitely increase our debt servicing ratio again. So we're basically back to square one, and it's even tougher because if you understand the context right now, there's an additional if I'm not mistaken, $1.18 billion in Eurobond repayments that we're paying by November this year. So if we add all of that, we're going to incur even far more debt servicing ratio to our GDP than normal. And that's not healthy for a very precarious and fragile economy that we currently have. The reforms have stabilized to an extent a number of things, but what is the gain if you just further stabilize the already stabilizing situation? Because remember, with more debt servicing thresholds, it increases the pressure on the naira, and the naira weakens. And if the naira weakens, there's a direct correlation to the weakening of the naira and increase in inflation. And most of our inflation is actually FX related, for those who do not know the context.
And I was about to get into that, but let's pick up from there since you're there already. We're planning to borrow in multiple currencies: yen, euro, dollars. What are the implications for our currency, considering we're dealing with different exchange rates? So let us into the implications for the naira and repayments, right? Especially because we're dealing with multiple currencies.
Yes, whenever it's time to do debt repayment, especially one for FX-dominated debt, most especially the euro bonds, there's always a weakening of the naira, no matter how small, for those who always monitor these movements in the FX market. So understand that an increase in that debt servicing or debt repayment threshold is definitely going to weaken the naira. And if we're not increasing the value of our export earnings, especially crude oil export earnings, then that further puts the naira in jeopardy, especially in the context of the very well-worked geopolitics that we're currently enduring in the environment. First and foremost, energy prices are, stabilizing and can further reduce, especially global crude oil prices. And if crude oil global prices continue to reduce because of Donald Trump's pump oil mantra or some form of stabilization in that form, that also further puts the naira in jeopardy, because again, 90% of our FX earnings actually come from our exports of crude oil. So putting all of this into context, you can understand why a lot of analysts and economists are really worried or getting worried about this situation.
And, zooming out a bit, would you say, given everything that's happening globally, is now a good time to borrow, to dig yourself deeper into debt? And, there are those who have also, defended the borrowings that, okay, they plan to borrow from reputable, most of our loans are from reputable lenders. So, we're not going to dig ourselves into any major debt trap or crisis. What are your thoughts on that?
So, just to put further context, so that the audience understands, there's nothing wrong from a public finance perspective in borrowing, especially when you're borrowing for infrastructure needs. However, the context with Nigeria's public fiscal space is that currently our debt servicing is higher than our appropriation for capital projects, capital infrastructure projects. So that is where the biggest concern is. So to answer your question, it is not problematic if you just look at it at face value. But when you go deep into the details, and like they always say, the devil is in the details, we're actually going to spend even more on debt repayment than what we're spending on infrastructure. Now, that's not healthy for any context. To use your personal finance lens, for instance, imagine borrowing and then your interest rate payments actually more than what you're spending that money that you're borrowing for. There's a problem, right? From a personal finance perspective, right? That's the same thing when you're looking at it from a government, public finance, government perspective, or even just running a business, for instance, where your interest rate payments are higher than the capital projects that you're indulging. What's the essence of actually going to the international debt market to borrow? So we need to be able to stabilize that situation first. And then once we're able to stabilize that situation, then you can actually justify going to the international debt market to borrow. So how do you do that? You have to expand domestic revenue mobilization, which the government, in fairness, the government has done so with the tax reform bills, but it remains to be seen in terms of execution, because once this gets the presidential assent, those 4 tax reform bills get presidential assent, we will now want to see the implementation gains from that. And it is the implementation gains from that that will tell us whether the government is right to go into the international debt market and add $24 billion. But to be honest, if you ask me, I would say it's a very premature step. Should have waited until we saw some form of implementation of the tax reform bills to see whether the policy transmission increased domestic revenue. Then you now reduce the threshold of debt repayment, which ensures that when you borrow $24 billion, you can actually have more of that money go into capital projects, which is the benefit, that's the actual benefit of borrowing in the context of public finance.
Mm-hmm. So the borrowing is paced and well-timed. That's also very integral there. Thank you. We're going on a break right now. We'll get a little deeper into the conversation and then tie it together after this break. You're still watching Business Edge. There's nothing wrong with borrowing. We have Basil Abia, who shared his thoughts on what's happening now with the government seeking approval to borrow 45 trillion naira more. That's $24 billion. Thank you for staying with us, Basil.
Thank you, John.
Yes, and I mean, with conversations like this, you have highlighted, of course, there's nothing wrong with borrowing. With conversations like this, the question always comes up, do we have a spending problem? Do we have a revenue problem, right? What has gotten us in this situation?
It's a combination of both. We, as a country, we have a spending problem and we have a revenue problem. Now, from the spending problem perspective, when you are governing people, you're accountable to them first, especially using the democratic context of how we govern in Nigeria. You're accountable to the people. And secondly, you're supposed to govern using principles, macroeconomic principles, like opportunity costs. So you have to weigh what's the cost that you're going to lose when you're spending money on this compared to spending money on that, right? That's the common sense to public finance and governance. In the context of Nigeria, if you look at a number of our spendings over the last 20 years, it doesn't really make sense, especially when you're juxtaposing it with our revenue earnings, right? So I'll give you some stats. As a country, we have spent over $7 billion on turnaround maintenance of our refineries. And right now, you cannot categorically say that a single government-owned refinery of ours does actual refining outside of blending. That's not the case. So the only functional refinery, or one of the few functional refineries in Nigeria, are all privately held refineries. And the biggest one, of course, is the one in Lagos, owned by Dangote Group, the Dangote Refinery, right? It doesn't make any sense that you're spending $7 billion and you're getting next to nothing from it. Let's not forget that the Port Harcourt refinery and Mori refineries, both refineries that got injections of close to $2.5 billion by the NMPCL, have now been temporarily shut down. Now, if I add the other part, budget just released a report of insertions in our budget fiscal year since 2021 till date. And if you do the math, if you convert everything to dollars, we have taken close to $10 billion worth of insertions of over 20,000 projects. Over 20,000 projects, most of them obviously duplicated over the fiscal year since 2021 to 2025. That's the worth of the insertions, or what other people call paddings, in our budget that the National Assembly has overseen and executed. What has that given us? Have we seen an increase in our infrastructure stock? No, the data is there for everyone to see. And if you don't even want to use the data, just use your eye test or your lens as a human being. And our infrastructure stock as a country hasn't really increased. Honestly, we're still struggling from our energy poverty. Our national grid has a capacity that is not more than 5,800 megawatts in terms of active generation for electricity. Our roads are terrible across board. Our ports are not functioning at a high level. We have very high defectation rates in our seaports. We need more seaports for the volume of trade that the country ought to be able to execute, especially with our neighbors in Central Africa and West Africa. So when you put all of that into context, from the spending perspective, we are misallocating capital. We're spending recklessly when we're not earning well. And then from a revenue perspective, until last year, we had shrinking revenues, both from crude oil and from non-crude oil exports. So all of that put into context shows that Nigeria has both a spending problem and a revenue problem. And we need to fix both of that if we want our country to be fiscally healthy in the coming decade.
Yeah, there's so much to be fixed from what you're saying. Misallocation of funds, so it's a spending problem, it's also a revenue problem. But as we propose to dig ourselves deeper into debt, questions are, can we dig our way back up? We know that the government, back out, we know that the government has undergone several critical fiscal reforms, revenue generating strategies, tax reform bill, and so much more going on across board. Do you think we are positioned to offset these future debt obligations?
Not with the $24 billion that we're adding, honestly. Like I mentioned much earlier, we needed to plan this better. This is exactly the same concern I have with the reforms. A lot of the reforms that were carried out by the current President Bola and the Tinubu presidency were, mistimed and then also misaligned in that sense. That caused most of the stress that we're feeling from the domestic economy perspective, especially when it comes to the normal Nigerians, the everyday Nigerians, and the crunches that we're feeling, which explains the very high inflation, in spite of the fact that our inflation calculation methodology by NBS has been rebased in that sense. So it comes back to the issue, how do we do this? Like I mentioned earlier, again, I'm going to repeat myself again. What you do is you first and foremost ensure that you no longer have debt repayments that is more than your capital projects appropriations. When you do that, it's now healthy enough to indulge in those forms of external borrowings, because what that means is that structurally, the finance that you're accessing, especially in the international debt market, is actually able to go and feed into our infrastructure needs. Don't forget, we need to be spending $30 billion every year from now to 2030, according to the World Bank, to meet our current infrastructure deficits. But we're not doing that, and we're not doing that because we have problems that are, inimical to us accessing the international debt market to fill those needs. How do you fix this? You fix this by expanding your revenues, both externally and domestically. External revenues have to expand. We have to, diversify how we earn. We have to increase our exports. We need to do that at huge scale.
Right.
We also need to increase our crude oil exports, which we are not doing. No, we are still struggling at our 1.5 billion barrels rate, when as a country, just about a decade ago, we were comfortably doing 2.2 to 2.4 million barrels per day. And this was the case from the 1970s till date. But then we now tanked over 1 million, which means, again, as a country, we really do not know how to indulge in growth. It's such a problem that in your 1970s and your 1980s, you're comfortably doing 2 million barrels. And then in your 2020s, the age of artificial intelligence, you're struggling to get by at 1.5 million barrels. And there are a number of reasons why. This is a conversation about debt, so I'll stick to that.
All right.
But when the conversation about increasing crude oil exports, we can indulge in that in a later day and time.
Yes, I mean, it's quite a situation we find ourselves in. We're not spending enough, we're not making enough, and we're perhaps borrowing too much. But thank you so much, Basil Abia, co-founder Veriv Africa, for giving us your perspective on this conversation.